December 7th, 1943, Pacific Theater. Japanese ace pilot, Lieutenant Commander Takeshi Yamamoto, prepared for what should have been a perfect surprise attack, flying in radio silence 200 miles from his target, when suddenly American fighters appeared from impossible angles, as if they could see through clouds and darkness itself. What Yamamoto didn't know was that America had deployed a secret weapon so advanced that every single Japanese plane was being tracked in real time by mobile radar units that shouldn't have existed according to Japanese intelligence. But how did America develop technology so far ahead of Japan that their best pilots were flying blind into what was essentially a technological ambush? December 7th, 1943. The sun rose blood red over the Pacific Ocean as Lieutenant Commander Takeshi Yamamoto adjusted his flight goggles and gripped the controls of his Mitsubishi Zero fighter plane. The morning air felt crisp against his face as he led his squadron of 12 pilots toward what their commanders promised would be a perfect surprise attack on American forces in the Philippines. Japan was fighting for its life in 1943. The war had been going on for 2 long years, and things were getting harder every day. In Tokyo, housewives melted down their copper pots and aluminum rice cookers to make bullets and airplane parts. Children collected scrap metal from the streets. Even the temple bells were taken down and shipped to weapons factories. Food was so scarce that many families ate rice mixed with sawdust just to fill their stomachs. The Japanese military was running out of everything. Fuel was so precious that new pilots learned to fly on wooden gliders before they ever touched a real airplane engine. Radio equipment came from factories that were being bombed almost daily. Most planes had radios that barely worked past 10 miles. When they did work, the static was so bad that pilots could hardly hear each other speak. But the military leaders told their pilots not to worry about equipment. They said the Americans were soft and lazy. American soldiers, they claimed, could not fight as hard as Japanese warriors who had trained their whole lives in the way of Bushido. The samurai spirit, they promised, would defeat American machines. Yamamoto had believed these words when he first started flying. He was born in a small fishing village where his grandfather taught him that honor mattered more than life itself. At age 12, he entered military school, where instructors woke the boys at 4 in the morning for sword practice. They learned to ignore pain, hunger, and cold. By the time he became a pilot, Yamamoto could fly his Zero through storms that would terrify most men. His squadron had practiced this attack for 3 months. They would fly low over the water to avoid being seen. American radar, their intelligence officers said, was clumsy and could only see planes that flew high and straight. The big radar dishes sat on hills like sitting ducks, easy to spot and even easier to avoid. Once they got close to the American base, they would climb fast, drop their bombs, and disappear before the enemy knew what hit them. The other pilots in Yamamoto's squadron were just as confident. Lieutenant Sato had shot down 4 American planes over Guadalcanal. Ensign Tanaka was only 19 but could make his Zero dance through the air like a bird. They all wore white headbands with red circles painted on their foreheads, symbols of the rising sun that would bring victory to Japan. As they flew through the early morning darkness, Yamamoto felt the familiar excitement before battle. The ocean stretched endlessly below them, dark blue water reflecting the last stars before dawn. Their engines hummed in perfect formation. No radio chatter broke the silence. This was how surprise attacks were supposed to work. They had been flying for 2 hours and were still 200 miles from their target when something impossible happened. Yamamoto saw dots in the sky ahead of them, growing larger by the second. American fighter planes were rising from the horizon, flying directly toward his squadron as if they had been waiting for them. But that could not be possible. There was no way the Americans could have known they were coming. Yamamoto's squadron had maintained complete radio silence. They had flown the route that intelligence said was safe from American radar. They were still so far from any American base that enemy planes should not even be in the area. The American fighters kept coming. Yamamoto counted at least 20 P-38 Lightnings and P-51 Mustangs, more than his small squadron could handle. Worse, the American planes were positioned perfectly, flying in formation as if they had been tracking the Japanese squadron for hours. Yamamoto felt his stomach drop as a terrible thought entered his mind. What if Japanese intelligence was wrong? What if the Americans had equipment that could see much farther than anyone believed possible? The American fighters attacked with precision that shocked every Japanese pilot. They did not charge forward like wild animals. Instead, they moved like pieces on a chessboard, each plane knowing exactly where the others would be. When Yamamoto turned left to dodge bullets, an American fighter was already waiting there. When Lieutenant Sato dove toward the ocean, 2 enemy planes followed him down as if they had predicted his exact move. The battle lasted only 15 minutes, but it felt like hours. Yamamoto watched half his squadron get shot down or damaged so badly they had to turn back toward Japan. The Americans fought like they could read Japanese minds. Every trick that had worked against other enemies failed completely. When Yamamoto finally broke free from the battle, his Zero had 3 bullet holes in the wing and his radio was completely dead. As he flew home alone through the morning sky, questions raced through his mind that he could not answer. How had the Americans known exactly where to find them? How had enemy fighters been waiting in the perfect position to attack? Most frightening of all, if American technology was this advanced, what other surprises were waiting for Japanese forces? The red sun that had seemed like a good omen that morning now looked like a warning of blood to come. 3 weeks later, Yamamoto's damaged Zero finally gave out during another mission over the Philippines. American bullets tore through his engine, and black smoke filled his cockpit as he struggled to control his falling plane. The ocean rushed up to meet him, and everything went dark when his Zero hit the water with a crash that felt like hitting a concrete wall. He woke up on the deck of an American destroyer, his head wrapped in clean white bandages and his flight suit replaced by dry American clothes. The ship's doctor, a young man who looked barely old enough to shave, checked his wounds with gentle hands and spoke to him in broken Japanese. The food they gave him was strange but filling. Real meat, white bread, and something sweet they called chocolate that melted on his tongue like nothing he had ever tasted. But what shocked Yamamoto most was not the food or the medical care. It was the machine he saw on the ship's deck the next morning. A large dish, bigger than his family's entire house, turned slowly in circles on top of a metal tower. Green light flickered on screens inside a nearby room. And American sailors who looked like teenagers watched the displays with calm faces. One of the sailors noticed Yamamoto staring and walked over to him. The young man could not have been older than 20, with red hair and freckles across his nose. He pointed to the spinning dish and said in simple English, "Radar, we see you coming from very far away." Yamamoto felt his heart sink as he realized what this meant. The Americans had not gotten lucky during his squadron's attack. They had been watching Japanese planes on their screens like hawks watching mice in a field. Every Japanese pilot who thought he was flying in secret had been as visible as if he were carrying a bright lantern in the darkness. The American sailor seemed proud of his machine. He pointed to the screen and showed Yamamoto green dots that moved across the display. "Japanese planes," he said, tapping the glass. 20, maybe 30 miles away. We tell our fighters where to go." As the destroyer sailed toward a prisoner of war camp in Australia, Yamamoto saw more impossible things every day. Supply ships arrived with mountains of food, fuel, and equipment. The Americans threw away bread that was only 2 days old. They used fresh water to wash their clothes, while Japanese soldiers had been drinking muddy water from shell holes. At the prisoner camp, Yamamoto met other captured Japanese pilots who told him stories that seemed like fairy tales. One pilot described seeing American mechanics fix airplane engines using electric tools that worked faster than 10 men with hammers. Another had watched American factories that could build entire airplanes in the time it took Japanese workers to make just the wings. The most shocking story came from Lieutenant Sato, who had survived the same battle where Yamamoto was shot down. Sato had been captured near an American airbase where he saw something that broke his understanding of how war worked. Trucks the size of houses carried radar equipment that could be set up anywhere in just a few hours. The Americans did not need to build permanent radar stations on hills. They could move their electronic eyes wherever they wanted, whenever they wanted. But the moment that changed everything for Yamamoto happened on a hot afternoon in February 1944. An American supply truck arrived at the prisoner camp, and the driver began unloading cases of ice-cold Coca-Cola for the guards. The bottles were so cold that water drops formed on the glass in the 100-degree heat. The American guards drank the soda like it was ordinary water while they worked at their radar screens, tracking Japanese planes that were hundreds of miles away. Yamamoto watched a guard who could not have been older than his own son back home. The young man sipped his Coca-Cola and pointed to green dots on his radar screen, then picked up a radio and calmly told American fighter pilots exactly where to find Japanese bombers. The bombers were 200 miles away, but the American boy could see them as clearly as if they were flying right overhead. The contrast hit Yamamoto like a physical blow. Here was an American teenager drinking ice-cold soda in the middle of a war, using machines that could see across impossible distances, while Japanese pilots flew blind into battles they had already lost before they left the ground. This was not just about having better equipment. This was about living in a completely different world. That night, lying on his cot in the prisoner barracks, Yamamoto tried to understand what he had learned. Japanese intelligence had told them that Americans were weak and their technology was simple. But every day brought new evidence that Japan had been fighting an enemy they never truly understood. The other prisoners whispered among themselves about the things they had seen: American factories that worked around the clock, radar systems that could track dozens of planes at once, radio networks that let commanders talk to fighters anywhere in the Pacific Ocean, supply chains that delivered fresh food and cold drinks to soldiers fighting on islands thousands of miles from home. As Yamamoto closed his eyes, one terrible question kept him awake. If the Americans had technology this advanced, and if they could produce it in such huge amounts that even prison camp guards had access to it, then what other weapons were they building that Japanese forces had never imagined? The breaking point came on a rainy morning in March 1944, when American officers invited captured Japanese pilots to attend what they called an educational briefing. Yamamoto and 15 other prisoners sat in wooden chairs inside a large tent, while Captain Robert Mackenzie, a radar specialist from Massachusetts, stood before a detailed chart that covered an entire wall. Mackenzie was not trying to be cruel or show off. He spoke quietly, almost gently, as he explained how American radar systems worked across the Pacific Ocean. He pointed to colored lines that connected dozens of radar stations from Australia to Alaska, creating what he called an electronic net that could track every airplane within 1,000 miles of any Allied base. The captain used simple words, but what he described was beyond anything Yamamoto had imagined possible. Individual radar units could see planes up to 200 miles away, but when they worked together, they created a picture of the entire sky above the Pacific Ocean. Every Japanese plane that took off from any airfield was detected within minutes. American commanders could watch Japanese squadrons form up, track their exact routes, and send fighters to intercept them at precisely the right time and place. Mackenzie drew circles on his map to show radar coverage areas. The circles overlapped like fish scales, leaving no gaps where Japanese planes could hide. He explained how radar operators talked to each other, using telephone lines and radio networks that stretched across thousands of miles of ocean. When one station spotted enemy planes, every other station knew about it within seconds. But the most crushing revelation came when Mackenzie showed them photographs of mobile radar units. These were not the big permanent installations that Japanese intelligence had told them about. These radar systems were mounted on trucks and ships that could move anywhere American forces needed them. Some were so small they could be carried in the back of a regular army truck, but they were still powerful enough to guide fighter planes to their targets with deadly accuracy. Yamamoto felt something break inside his chest as he realized the full meaning of what he was hearing. Every mission he had ever flown, every surprise attack he had planned, every time he thought he was being clever or brave, American radar operators had been watching him on their screens like children watching ants crawl across a sidewalk. The captain then showed them something even more shocking. He pulled out a thick book filled with detailed information about Japanese airplanes, including technical drawings of Yamamoto's own Zero fighter. The Americans knew the exact speed, turning ability, fuel capacity, and weapons load of every plane in the Japanese Air Force. They had studied Japanese tactics so carefully that they could predict what Japanese pilots would do before the pilots themselves knew. Mackenzie explained how American fighter pilots received constant radio updates from radar controllers who could see the entire battle from above. Japanese pilots flew alone, unable to talk to each other because their radios barely worked. American pilots flew as part of a team guided by electronic eyes that never blinked and electronic voices that never stopped talking. During a break in the briefing, Yamamoto walked outside into the rain and stood under a tree, trying to process what he had learned. Lieutenant Sato joined him, and they stood together in silence for several minutes. Finally, Sato spoke in a whisper, as if saying the words too loudly might make them more real. "We were never fighting American pilots," Sato said, rainwater dripping from his hair. "We were fighting American machines, and the machines were always watching us." Yamamoto nodded slowly. "We flew into battle believing we were invisible spirits of the divine wind. Instead, we were moths drawn to a flame that could see us coming from hundreds of miles away. We were never fighting America. We were fighting America's science, and we brought swords to a war of mathematics." That evening, Yamamoto sat on his cot and wrote in a small notebook that the American guards had given him. His hands shook as he tried to put his thoughts into words that made sense. Everything he had been taught about war, about honor, about the power of the warrior spirit, had been proven wrong by teenagers with radar screens and ice-cold Coca-Cola. The Americans had not defeated Japan through superior courage or fighting spirit. They had defeated Japan by turning science fiction into reality, while Japanese leaders clung to the beliefs of ancient samurai warriors. The divine wind that was supposed to protect Japan had been no match for the wind generated by American propellers, guided by American mathematics. Built by American factories that could produce miracles as easily as they produce soft drinks. In his notebook, Yamamoto wrote the words that would haunt him for the rest of his life. "Our defeat began not when their bombs fell on our ships, but when we chose honor over understanding. While we prayed to the spirits of our ancestors, they built machines that could see through clouds and darkness. While we trained our bodies to ignore pain, they trained their minds to solve problems we never knew existed." As rain drummed on the roof of the prisoner barracks, Yamamoto understood that Japan had lost the war before it began. Not because Japanese soldiers lacked courage, but because Japanese leaders had refused to believe that the world had changed. They had sent brave men to fight a modern war with ancient ideas, and now those men were paying the price for their leaders' stubborn blindness. The hardest part was knowing that thousands more Japanese pilots were still out there, flying missions they believed were secret, never knowing that American radar screens showed every move they made. September 15, 1946. The train from Tokyo to Yamamoto's home village moved slowly through a landscape that looked like the surface of the moon. Where rice fields had once stretched green and endless, black craters filled with stagnant water reflected a gray sky. Where wooden houses had stood for generations, only concrete foundations remained like broken teeth in a giant's mouth. Yamamoto pressed his face against the train window and watched Japan pass by in ruins. American bombers had visited every city, every factory, every bridge. The destruction was so complete that it seemed impossible anyone could still be alive. Yet somehow, people had survived. They lived in shacks made from pieces of metal and cardboard, growing vegetables in bomb craters, rebuilding their world one brick at a time. The train station in his village was gone, replaced by a wooden platform that looked like it might blow away in the next strong wind. Yamamoto's younger sister Michiko waited for him there, but he almost did not recognize her. The plump, smiling girl he remembered had become a thin woman with tired eyes and hands that looked much older than her 22 years. They walked home through streets that were mostly empty spaces where buildings used to stand. Michiko told him about the bombing raids, about how the family had hidden in caves while American planes dropped fire from the sky. She described nights when the whole horizon glowed orange and the sound of engines never stopped. She spoke about these things in a flat voice, as if she was reading from a grocery list instead of describing the end of the world. Their family home was still standing, but barely. Half the roof had been blown away and patched with pieces of tin and old newspapers. The wooden walls were cracked, and wind whistled through gaps that had been stuffed with rags. In the main room where his grandfather had once taught him calligraphy, water dripped from the ceiling into metal buckets that rang like broken bells. His parents had aged 20 years in the 3 he had been gone. His father, once a proud fisherman with strong hands and a loud laugh, now moved like an old man even though he was only 50. His mother cried when she saw Yamamoto, but even her tears seemed tired. They had so little food that his first meal home was rice mixed with grass and roots that his sister had dug up from the forest. That evening, as the family sat around a small fire made from broken furniture, Yamamoto tried to explain what he had learned in the American prison camp. He told them about radar systems that could see airplanes from 200 miles away. He described factories that could build entire planes in the time it took Japanese workers to hammer out a single wing. He talked about supply ships that brought ice cream and cold soft drinks to soldiers fighting on tiny islands thousands of miles from home. His family listened politely, but he could see in their eyes that they did not really believe him. The things he described sounded like stories from fairy tales. How could any country be so rich that prison guards drank ice-cold soda while working? How could machines see through clouds and darkness like magic? His own father shook his head and said that Americans must have been trying to trick him with lies and propaganda, but Yamamoto knew what he had seen was real. The proof was all around them in the ashes of Japan, a country that could build radar networks covering the entire Pacific Ocean, that could coordinate thousands of airplanes across half the world, that could produce so much of everything that they threw away food that was only 2 days old. Such a country could certainly reduce Japan to rubble whenever it chose to do so. Over the following weeks, as Yamamoto helped his family rebuild their home and their lives, he began to understand something that would shape the rest of his time on Earth. Japan had lost the war, not because Japanese people were weak or cowardly, but because Japanese leaders had refused to understand what kind of war they were really fighting. While America built universities that taught young people to solve problems with science and mathematics, Japan had built military schools that taught young people to die with honor. While American factories learned to mass-produce complex machines, Japanese craftsmen still made things one at a time, using methods passed down for centuries. While American generals used radio networks and radar systems to coordinate battles across entire oceans, Japanese commanders sent messages by horseback and made plans based on guesswork and hope. Yamamoto began visiting other villages, talking to farmers and fishermen and anyone who would listen. He told them that Japan's future depended on learning from its defeat. The country needed schools that taught science instead of just obedience. It needed factories that could build modern machines instead of just copying old designs. Most importantly, it needed leaders who were willing to admit when they were wrong and change course before it was too late. Many people did not want to hear these ideas. They preferred to believe that Japan had lost because the war gods had turned away, or because traitors had weakened the country from within, or because Americans had cheated by using weapons that were somehow unfair. It was easier to blame bad luck or evil enemies than to accept that Japan had simply been outthought and outbuilt by a more advanced society. But some people listened, especially young men and women who had seen enough death and destruction to last several lifetimes. They understood that the old ways had led to disaster, and they were hungry for new ideas that might lead to something better. In his final diary entry, written 20 years after the war ended, Yamamoto reflected on the lesson that had taken him so long to learn. In captivity, I discovered that America's greatest weapon was not their radar or their planes or their bombs. It was their willingness to believe that tomorrow could be better than today, and their determination to make that belief come true through hard work and clear thinking.